And we're recording. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to part 5 of Game Design Online. This is all about refining your rules writing. So we're talking about kind of taking your written rules and turning them into a well-written format that can be referred to as a proper rule book. And we're going to talk about some things like structure, use of paragraphs, all sorts of exciting things like that. For context, this is part 5. We've already had parts 1 to 4, which were initially talking about some of the things that can get in the way of making games. We've talked about things that you need to do when you start a project. We talked about kind of research and finding inspiration. We talked about playtesting and the kind of things that you need to think about when you're doing that. We've talked last week about taking your game and starting to write it down and codify it with like a mechanical build rulebook. And this week we're going to talk about how to refine that document and turn it into something you can really use both as a reference and a teaching guide for your players. Next week, talk about what happens next. And there's a lot to talk about there. Quick recap of the NeedyCat design process. We have kickoff, research, test build, which is lots of nice and quick and dirty ideas to find out what your game is. Mechanical draft, where we start codifying it. We go from the very central gameplay loop of the test build and start pulling it out, thinking about the start and the end of the game. We then go into the full build once that's been developed and find out, we fill in, we add the depth as well as the breadth that we added in the mechanical build. And then finally we get to the sort of handover and amends stage of things. So today we're talking about kind of mostly stuff that you'll start doing in the full build. Some of it will come in the mechanical build as well, though. Most importantly, though, this is really a section about rules writing as opposed to game design, two different things. This is about creating documentation for your game. There's no point trying to write documentation for a thing until you finish making the thing. So before you attempt any of the kind of high-level structure type stuff we're doing here, make sure you've designed your game. If you're here on the weekly course, either watching tonight or watching later in the week, this will be stuff that you won't get to for a while. But we kind of front load it all here, so you know what to expect once your game that you're working on has got a bit further down the line. As ever, I have to say this disclaimer every time. I'm not the complete expert. Like, there is no one true way to do this. We recommend you break these rules and do your own thing. But of course, having a baseline is always helpful, right? Questions? Please pop questions in the chat if you're here. If you have other questions, we can do a little quick chat in the Discord later. Also, if you want to talk about things you've been working on, any sort of bits and bobs that you've been doing in the week, come along and see us on Discord. And if you are seeing this after the fact, also come and see us on Discord. You have access to this Discord server. You can follow the link there. Come see us. Ask us any questions you have about anything that was happening here. So that's all the preamble out of the way. Let's get on with some actual learning, shall we? So first of all, we're going to talk about rules terms. In the process of designing a game, you're going to introduce a whole load of new terms, new phrases, new things that are specific to your game. Okay, and it is very easy to forget how confusing those can be to a new player, especially if you've been developing your game for a while. You can start thinking that terms like, I don't know, resource phase has some kind of inherent meaning, and it's very easy to forget to establish the meanings of those. And so this is part of what we're talking about. It's like an ongoing theme for this seminar is the order in which you write your rules is often just as important as how you write the rules themselves. Okay. So yeah, as it says here, a rules term is anything which is attributed additional meaning in your game beyond its standard use. So as I said, names of phases, names of rules, damage, or whatever it is, all sorts of things can be rules terms. If it has a meaning in your game that it wouldn't normally have in regular life, that's a rules term. Also, your components, if you have components in your game, can be a rules term. So, for example, you might have these over here are marker tokens, and when you call them marker tokens, and that's the thing you call them, that's now a rules term. You might want to highlight your rules terms with some formatting. So, for example, you might make them bold, italic, capital letters at the start, underlining. There are various things you might want to do. And the thing to remember is that it can be helpful because it helps players see which things are rules terms. But if you do it too much, it can look really cluttered. There's a couple of examples here. That's the manuscript for Hellboy that I handed over, and also that's the rulebook for Steel Colosseum, which we're launching on Kickstarter very shortly. In Hellboy, I was attempting to put a rules term in bold the first time it was used in a section, and I don't know what I thought of that. In hindsight, it ended up getting taken out and removed. I think the editor ended up just using capital letters or something for certain terms. But yeah, the bolding went because there was too much of it on the page. With Steel Colosseum, I've got italics for components, and I've got bold for just generic rules terms. Oh, sorry, hang on, my background's phasing in. 1 second, let me see if I can fix this. Oh no, the illusion is the illusion's not working anymore. Oh no, people realize I don't just live in, there we go, in a room that is yellow. Is it the light? Could that be it? There we go. That's more like it. Sorry about that. Yes. So as you can see, I've used a couple of different ways there of showing rules terms. And I've tried to be consistent with capitalization and bold, italics, that sort of thing, just so that a player knows if I see something in italics, oh, that means that's a component. So I can go and look at the components list at the start of the rulebook and see what it's meant to look like. Okay. But again, if you use too much of this, it can really confuse things, and that's not good. One of the most important things with rules terms is making them consistent. What I mean by that is every term should have one meaning, and that meaning should only correspond to that rules term. It's very, again, when you work on a project for a period of time and you go through multiple stages of development, it's very easy to just kind of use old terminology that you've used in previous versions. One of my most common one is markers, tokens, and counters. In my games, I will use the term marker, token, counter. I'll use those three terms interchangeably, and that's bad. And I end up having to kind of pick a lane and stick to it. And what I've kind of settled on is tokens are generally things which represent something in the game. Markers are an abstract thing which marks something abstract, and a counter is something which goes along a track in some way to count things. That's my own rule, completely arbitrary, and I try to stick with that, but I will still find myself saying resource mark when I mean resource token. And so that is unhelpful. So you have to be consistent in that regard. Also, standard formatting, if you decide that all your rules terms have to have a capital letter at the start, or they all have to have the first word in the rules phrase capitalized and the others are not, all capitals, underlined, whatever, you have to decide on that and stick to it. It could be that you're also thinking in terms of across all the different rules terms. So you have an internal system. So all of my rules terms are capitalized, or actually you'll decide rules terms that pertain to this particular thing will be capitalized, ones that pertain to this will not. It's really, really helpful, and I'll talk a bit more about this next week, but it's really helpful to create a document that we call a lexicon, just an Excel spreadsheet, which has all of your rules terms listed alphabetically, what they mean, and what terms should not be used. So, for example, I would have resource token or resource marker, whatever it is I'm ending up using, as my thing that it should be. And in my it's not this, I would put resource counter resource token. And so when it comes to reviewing it, when I come to give that to an editor maybe to look at, I can show them, look out for these terms here because they shouldn't be in the book. We talked about ignorables previously, things that you can ignore at various stages. And this consistency is totally inignorable in the test build. And it doesn't really become a thing you have to start worrying about until kind of halfway through mechanical build. When you're in that testing cycle, you've been testing the game for a while, and you're starting to refine and tighten up. Do not worry about it for your first draft of the mechanical build. It should be as you're starting to come to the point where you want to start moving into the full build. That's where you start thinking about consistency and maybe creating the lexicon. let's talk about mental load. So I think I mentioned this briefly last week, but the idea is that if when a player is trying to learn your game, they have a limited amount of brain power. Okay, think of it like RAM with a computer. They have a limited working memory that they can use. And whenever you use a new rules term, whenever you say it for the first time in your rulebook, your player immediately commits part of that brain power to comprehending it. We call that mental load. Okay. Once you've explained that term, once you kind of put it to bed and said what it is, the player now understands it, and their mental load is reduced, because until that point, their brain is kind of going, but what does it mean? And they're looking for context clues to figure out what it is you've said, because human brains are very good like that. You can give a human brain a word it doesn't understand the meaning for, and it will try to understand what that term means just by the things that are around it. So you have to think of this in terms of rules terms. And the number of times I've read rule books, even recently, published games, where terms are used which are not then explained until maybe a couple of chapters later in the rule book. And that whole time I'm thinking, well, okay, but what does it mean? What does it mean? And I'm almost skimming over sections in the middle. So if you're overloading a player, if you give them too many new terms without explaining them, if you give them too much mental load all at once, it is very likely that they might go, actually, this is far too complicated. I'm just going to go play something that I know how to play. And I've done that certainly several times with games. So how do you review it? What's a good way to kind of measure this? Here's what I recommend you do. Get your rule book, either print out your rules document or have it on a screen. Read through it and identify your rules terms, highlight them, maybe underline them or something so you can see where they are. And you can do this either after you've formatted them or before, whatever it is you do. But for each one, mark the point at which you first use it and the point at which it's explained. And that could be within the same page. It could be several pages. It could be, either end of the rule book. That whole section between those two bookends, that's like 1 point of mental load. Okay, think of it like that. So that's one thing that player is trying to understand. It will stack up because you will explain rules term A, and you'll use rules term A. Before you've explained rules term A, you'll use rules term B, and then rules term C, and you'll see that mental load stacking up. And every player's got a theoretical limit. I mean, it varies from player to player. But if you look at where those points of mental load are piling up, and lots of them are in use at the same time, then that becomes a place where you can look to reduce that mental load. And even before you give your text to your players, you can start refining and addressing the flow of information, how the information is flowing through your book. Okay. Now, there is a way to cheat. Because sometimes there's often a chicken and egg situation in a rulebook where you can't explain A until you've explained B. So you have to explain B first and explain A. But actually in B is something which kind of relates to A. So you kind of have to explain A as well at the same time. You can tie yourself in knots. You can cheat by using page references. Okay. Because what that does, if you say to a player, here's a new rules term, we will explain it later on. That's fine, because again, you're telling their brain, you don't need to look for context clues. I'm telling you what it is. You can just relax and it will all become apparent. So you tell them, it'll be explained later, and their mental load will drop. So you can't do it a lot. It doesn't completely remove mental load, but it certainly drops it down significantly from where it was while they were trying to figure out what that term was. So for example, here's another example from Steel Coliseum. This is in the section for how a turn works. So I wanted a nice self-contained section on this is what happens in your turn. And one of the main part of your turn is you do some actions based on the card you've played. And rather than, if I'd included all the rules for actions in that section, it would have made that page a lot less neat, right? Because it would have had to have gone, rather than one page of what a turn looks like, here's the page, and then a whole lot of other stuff, and then the end of the section. So instead, we have one nice neat page. It then says, as it says there, actions are explained in detail on pages 18 to 22. Don't worry, it says, we'll get to that. All you need to know for now is that actions happen now. And so that's it. You can't cheat the system completely, but it certainly does help. And if you're gonna do nothing at all, at least put a page reference in so that players can flick back and forth. So that is a bit of stuff about rules terms and how you can use them correctly. Any questions in that? Aha, Renato, hello. In my rulebook, I use enemy to represent all those opposed to the players, but opponents represent those opposed to a certain group. For example, the enemies are opponents of the players, but players are the opponents of the enemies. Right, hang on, it's been a long day. I'm trying to keep it in all sections. Does it make sense? Possibly. So you're using enemy to represent those opposed to the players. So you have the players, enemies. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so enemies opponents to the players. Yes, I'm with you. So opponent is a relative term. Enemy is, you have players and enemies. They are their opponents and they are their opponents. Is that what you're saying? Yes, brilliant. It makes sense. What I would say is, to do that, I would say just make sure you define it. I use a similar thing myself in quite a few games. So in Blitz Bowl, we have, is it Blitz Bowl? Is it Myth and Goal? One of them. I think like Myth and Goal, actually. We have friendly players, opposing players, opposing is relative in that way. I'm trying to think. There's definitely something I've used where it's had a something. Might even be Hellboy. We talk about different types of characters, and I think enemy is used to represent if it's an enemy, if it's a monster doing the action. We have heroes and monsters. If it's a monster doing the action, then the hero is the enemy. If it's the hero doing the action, the monster is the enemy. Key point is make sure you get it delineated and laid out and see how your players get along. Cool. Okay, so there we go. Fantastic. Next section, we talk about breaking down walls. And by walls, I mean walls of text. It's really, really easy to go on a ramble when you're writing rules and put far too much stuff into a paragraph. It can really put readers off. I have encountered rule books which have, like, you turn the page, it's just text, and I just want to put it down and go and have a cup of tea and do something else. Getting good at using paragraphs and using them sensibly will help players understand your rules and navigate your document in a way which works for them. So here is a rule from an early draft of the Hellboy board game. How easily can you grasp that? I'll give you a couple of moments just to read that and see if you can make sense of it. I'm going to turn the microphone off and blow my nose because you don't need to be hearing that. I'm back. Excuse me there. Right. So it's not a fun rule to read, right? It's very chunky. There's a lot of text. 2 line breaks though, and it becomes certainly not a concise rule because 2017 James liked writing a lot of words, but it's broken up more. The eye can navigate that more easily. If you compare the two, there's one, there's the other. And you can see that just looks friendlier and it's broken up. And it's broken up in a very specific way. So what has changed exactly? The main thing is that first example had multiple ideas in one paragraph. And so as a reader, you've got no context to see how much information you're getting at once. Going back to it. So a hero moves up to 2 areas. That's a statement that we're making. Then it tells us what that means. So to move the hero 1 area, pick it up, put it in an area that's adjacent to the one it's currently in. Remember, heroes can't move through walls, can't move diagonally through doors, can't move into an area that's already full. If there are enemies in the area the hero leaves, the hero takes 1 point of damage. Now we're onto a new thing, really. It's a subsection of that rule. Other heroes in the area that the moving hero is leaving can spend an action token. Each one spent allows the moving hero to ignore 1 enemy in the area. So that's basically 3 ideas in 1 paragraph. In the second example, we've broken that into 3 separate paragraphs. We've got, here's the summary of what it is, here's how it works, and here's an exception or a caveat. Okay. Doing that also adds white space around the text. White space is really important, and you're not expected as game designers to be graphic designers as well, but it's really helpful to have a basic understanding of like readability and that sort of thing. So all this kind of space around here that is introduced in this is so much nicer than this kind of big chunky wall. And it just helps the eye navigate it. You can keep track of where you are in the paragraph, right? When there's only a couple of lines. With here, it's much more easy to get lost. So yeah, it's basically just makes the whole thing a lot easier. When should you change paragraph? So a paragraph is a group of sentences all describing a single idea. And it says at the bottom there, the internet is full of writing and style guide type stuff, which goes into loads of information about how you should use paragraphs. But when it comes to rules writing, in my experience, you want to change paragraph when you introduce a new idea, when you zoom in or pull back to a new level of detail, or when you just want to pause for emphasis or give the reader a break. Sometimes one idea is too long for one paragraph and you want to just put a little break in the middle to make it easier. So let's analyze that rule and how we've ended up with the 3 paragraphs. So as it says there, first of all, we have the rule in summary, a nice like blanket statement. This is how the rule works. The hero moves up to 2 areas. Now we're adding detail. So we're zooming in on that rule to talk about how that rule works. To move the hero one area, etc., etc. The second sentence here, remember that heroes can't move through walls. It's explaining, it's carrying on explaining the same idea. So it's just making sure that the reader has full comprehension of that one idea that is described in that paragraph, i.e. the act of picking a hero up and moving it to a space 2 areas away. Then over here, though, we come down to if there are enemies in the area. So remember, we've got a new idea coming in, so we start a new paragraph. And again, other heroes in the area that you're leaving can spend action tokens. That is all part of what happens if there's an enemy in the area. So it's the same idea. So we're keeping that second sentence in the same paragraph. Now, this is not an exact science. Any act of writing is it's a creative, expressive thing. So there is, of course, leeway, but generally, more paragraphs are better. I'm not saying a new paragraph for every sentence. That spreads things out too much. Your page count goes way up. And again, players can't then really pass what's going on because everything looks the same. But generally, you can use paragraphs in this way, one idea at a time, and it will make things a lot easier to understand. Any questions on paragraphs? That's so weird on the green screen. There we go. Cool. So paragraphs, it's a nice, paragraphs is a fairly easy thing. I just want to get it in there because it's kind of a foundation for the next thing I would like to talk about. So let's talk about structuring and signposting. Okay, so as we talked about in session, I think it was session 2, talked about ideas, right? So a game is a collection of ideas. You'll have mechanical ideas, thematic ideas, all sorts of different things like that. You can generally group them into topics. So in the same way that a paragraph is a group of sentences that convey a single idea, a section is a group of paragraphs that convey a single topic. That topic might be how the movement phase works, or how you set up the game, whatever it might be. It can go more granular than that, but we'll see that in a moment. What we're going to find out, though, is how to organize your sections and how to use headers to help the players navigate through them. So here we go. Multiple paragraphs on the same topic, i.e. a set of linked ideas, form a section. So we have within a section potentially multiple subsections, each of which can explore a different part of the topic. If your topic is how to play the game, then you might have one section, which is how to play the game. And within that, you'll have a section talking about how the different phases of the game work, and one section talking about how, I don't know, player turns work, and so on and so forth. And each of those is a subsection. And you can kind of think of your top level sections, the ones that are not subsections themselves, because of course subsections can also have subsections. Your ones that are the top level ones are your chapters for your book. Even if you're not literally dividing it into chapters like a novel, it is very useful to think of your rulebook in terms of chapters, because that will help you organize your thoughts. We're going to do some work at the end on how to generally organize your chapters in a logical order. But let's say, for example, we've got a rulebook with these chapters. They won't necessarily have big sort of chapter, it won't have big chapter breaks like you would have in a novel, but we can see this is the order in which things are flowing, right? Each one of these covers a single broad topic. So we get an overview of the game, a component list, the objective for the game, how to set up, how to play, ending the game, and advanced rules. We've got, 7 sections, each of which is a large chapter covering a broad topic. That how to play one, let's zoom in on that. And that itself will have in that chapter various sections. So this is part of the how to play chapter. So the topic for the how to play chapter is how to play the game, all of those, all the things that we then find in here are subtopics based on a particular part of how to play the game. So we talk about, as it says here, round sequence, player phase, event phase, resolution phase. Let's zoom in again for the player phase. Let's look at a subsection within that. So now we have 3 subsections: initiative order, player actions, and ending the player phase. Each of these subsections is a subtopic of what happens in the player phase, and what happens in the player phase is a subtopic of how to play the game. So it's this constant kind of fractal nesting system where you can zoom in on levels of detail, but you always know that everything that you're reading in this subsection is all to do with the section above it. That section and all the sections at the same level are part of the chapter above it. And that way you can read and understand the rulebook and navigate it. And it's remarkable how many rulebooks I've seen that get this wrong and kind of, they'll have an idea that you need to put things in sections, but there won't be a sense of order. The best way to look at it really is to diagram it in this way. So if you imagine here, this is just showing that how to play section opened up like we just talked about. But if you could have each and every one of these chapters could have multiple sections with subsections within it. We refer to this as a structural hierarchy, and it's a way to review a rulebook. We do it with our own rulebooks, and we do it with rulebooks we review for other people, where we look at the manuscript and we note down all the different sections, subsections, chapters in this kind of way, and we look and we say, well, actually, does all of that stuff there actually belong to that section? Does that section belong to that chapter? And are these in the right order within that? And as you can see, you've got multiple levels. It's shown here with indentation. So these are our, let me get my pointer that's working. Oh, I have got a pointer, fantastic. This is our sort of our chapters. These are our first level sections. These are our subsections. Of course, each of these initiative order could have 3 or 4 subsections as well. Headings are like our signposts that we use to guide players through the different sections of the book. Okay, so each section or subsection that we have should always start with a relevant heading. Okay, sometimes, so we'll refer to them as for a chapter heading, we'll call it a title. For a subsection, we'll call it a subheading, but they are all headings. And getting good at headings will make it so much easier to structure your books. Okay, if you're using a word processing software like Word or Google Docs, they have heading functions built in. It took me years to bother to use them. Once I did, it made things an awful lot easier. Also, a lot of them will let you use headings to key off other features. So you can, if you're using Word, for example, you can insert page references using headings. You can point to a heading and it will update it to whatever the page that heading is currently on. So if you edit your book, you can tell it, you can update it and it will tell you now which page the heading's on. You can use it to create contents pages, indexes, that sort of thing. Anyway, point is, get good with headings because it will help you, as I said, signpost your document, right? It really helps, and I would say it's mandatory, that each level of heading has its own format. We can use numbers to refer to them. So going back to the example we had here, this would be an H1, a heading level 1, heading level 2, heading level 3. And again, if you go into Word, you'll have heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. But it really helps to have different formats for each one, because again, it makes it really obvious if a player can see that the top level heading is now going down to the second level heading and then is going into the third. It just helps them navigate. The reason it helps is they can see that if the heading is smaller than the last one, they know they're going down the hierarchy. Now learning about a subtopic of the topic they were just reading. Yeah, they were on a heading 2 section, which was what was it? How to play. How to play was a heading 1. They moved down to a heading 2, which is the player phase, and then they moved down to a heading 3, which is initiative. So they know that initiative is part of the player phase, which is part of the how to play section. If the heading is larger, then they're moving back up the hierarchy. They're coming up for air, and they're going onto a new topic or a new subtopic. Okay. Very importantly, your text should stay the same. Don't change the text format. Don't make your text smaller in the smaller sections. That could be a readability nightmare, but your headings should definitely change in format as you go. Here's what it could look like. So you might have, this is like my generic default formatting. With Word, you can, and also with Google Docs, you can set formatting templates. So all of my documents look something like this when I'm first writing them, where I have here's my heading 1, how to play. So boom, how to play. In this section, you will learn how to play the game, etc., etc. Then we come down one level in the hierarchy to the player phase, and that's a heading 2. So it's kind of a bold. We lose the underline, lose the small caps. Then down here for heading 3, the initiative order, we go into, again, smaller still. I tend to have 4 or 5 levels of headings in most games that I write. It's never a thing that I plan, but I can only think of one game where I've had to use a level 6 heading. And I'll be honest, at that point, generally, the real thing should be rewrite that section of your game so you're not going that deep into the hierarchy. But at one point, I really needed to use it. And often it will be 3 or 4, but 5 is quite common, especially with more complex games. You'll find that the more detailed your rules are, the more involved. So if you're doing like a heavy role-playing game or war game, you will often need more levels of heading than you will for a more simple board game. But yeah, basically get good at formatting your headings and use those headings to signpost those sections and organize your thoughts into sections so your players can navigate through your book. So that's about structure. Any questions? I saw someone typing, so I'm assuming, hey, here we go. This is good. I like the fact that people type the things and then drop them in at the end. So Renato, you've seen recently games divided into tutorials? Yes. Each introducing new game terms which found in the previous ones, like Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion. Yes. So yes, this is talking about games where it's sort of like a video game tutorial system, right? Where a game gives you gradual amounts of information. I did this with Warhammer Quest Silver Tower, which I did for Games Workshop, where over the course of the first, it wasn't done in individual quests, but it was designed to be read at the table. There was all sorts of reasons for this. Ask me another time. But the main point is that the players were walked through what a turn looks like. So on the first turn, the rulebook just told them the things that would happen on the first turn and the things they had to learn for that. Turn 2 introduced some new things. That is handy. And similarly, I mean, I've played Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion, where it brings in more things each time you play a new scenario. It's really helpful because, as we said last week, a rulebook is both a teacher and a reference book, right? That does the teacher part really well because it's very slowly drip feeding you the information. What's difficult is, as a reference, it becomes tricky to go back and find where the information is. Playing through Jaws of the Lion a year or so ago, I remember on multiple occasions going, oh, what are the rules for this particular thing? Having to go and flip back through pages of the book to find the scenario where we'd first learned it. And then what that does is that then has a separate reference book, which works that way. So yeah, I think it's a thing that works. Yeah, has the rules reference. What you have to hope though is that players will know what the thing is called, so they know where to look in the rules reference. This is one of the things I often find with Fantasy Flight rulebooks these days. They will often have a separate rules reference where everything is listed alphabetically, but because it's alphabetical, there's no real sense of structure to the overall document. So if you don't know which thing it comes under, you can struggle. For me, my preference is a well-written, well-structured rulebook with a logical start to finish order, with an index that can point you towards specific parts, and a separate tutorial book which kind of elaborates on that and talks you through your first games. But it is different for every game, and every player and every designer will have their own preference. And here we go. Yeah. So what's my opinion on games that have separate rule books and rules references? They fail as a game design. I answered that question without even reading it. Fantastic. So yeah, I think they're not failures. They're just it's a different approach. I think as long as as long as there is a structured rule book, I like to see that, because if I'm looking through a rule book and I want to find out the rules for, let's say it's a war game, I want to see rules for how terrain works in the game. And if I know that it's a structured rule book where all the kind of stuff about movement is in one place, I can go to the movement section. And somewhere in that sort of 5-10 pages, there'll be something about terrain, because that's part of movement. If it's in an alphabetical rules reference kind of thing, I'm thinking, well, will that be under M for movement, T for terrain, D for default terrain? What will it be under? And it just kind of becomes difficult to kind of instinctively get to know the book. but there are arguments each way, certainly. As I said at the start, this is the way that we recommend doing things. By all means, play around and try different things and see what works for you. So yeah, there we go. That is stuff about structuring and signposting. So next up, let's zoom out a bit further and talk about planning your rulebook as a whole. So structure, as we've shown, is really important in each section. As I was just saying, actually, it matters in the rulebook as a whole. A player should ideally, once they've read through the thing and played a game, they need to check a rule. They need to be able to kind of look at your rulebook and go, oh, the answer I need is probably about in this section. Turn into the right thing. Well-structured chapters will help players navigate your text. Most importantly, and I think this is true of a lot of things, it's like editing and a lot of other things, graphic design. If the structure is good, players will not notice it. You'll get no thanks for doing a meticulously structured rulebook. No, very few people. I mean, maybe someone somewhere will say, the structure on this book's really good. Generally, though, it's only a thing that comes up if it's bad. And certainly I'm guilty of this. I can think of a dozen poorly structured rulebooks that I've not enjoyed trying to learn a game through. I can't really think of any off the top of my head that are really, really good, because you just accept it. You expect it, because we are unreasonable as consumers, right? we expect good things. So yeah, think about how the chapters in your game are structured and how they present your game. I like to think of having a 4-part sequence in a rulebook. And again, depending on the format of your rulebook, there are different things you might do. But I like to think you can start off, this is a good general thing. So start off with an introduction. You're welcoming the players to the game, setting their expectations. You're showing them what's what, and just telling them what kind of experience they're going to be in for when they come to play. Then into the core game mechanics. So then you're teaching them kind of how to play their first game. You're not going into massive detail. You're not necessarily talking about all of the little things that might come up in every single game. Maybe you're leaving some things off the table for now, but you're telling them how to play. Then additional rules. So once they've played a couple of games, hey, you want to try some new things out? Throw these things in. And then the back matter is kind of reference material, anything which kind of helps them quickly find information, or is lots of information kind of bundled together. So it's less the tutorial stuff, more the sort of, reference for during a game. What it's doing there is the first 3 parts are guiding their journey into the game. And the last part is answering the questions as they come up. If you think about it, that is the rulebook doing what we said it had to do last week. It is filling in for you, the designer, at the table. When someone comes to your table to play a game, you're teaching them for the first time, you will introduce the game to them. You'll tell them what to expect and tell them, what everything is and what it looks like and what kind of game they're going to have. You will teach them how to play the game. If you're running a game for people that have played already, you will maybe introduce them to a few new rules. You might even do it mid-game. You might say, hey, look, now we're a couple of rounds in. Do you want to try this thing out? And then during play, you will help them by answering their questions in a quick, easy fashion. So by using this 4-part sequence, you are helping your rulebook do what it has to do and fill in for you at the table. And hopefully that's going to be helpful to your players. And here is a rough breakdown of the kind of things that you might put in each part. Okay. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. This is not meant to be a thing that is right for every single game, but these are kind of the baselines, right? Most games will probably need most of these things to a degree. But important question: if you can spot, if you can name all the rulebooks in the back of that picture, you win a prize. Most importantly, though, this is a general example. You can't say there is one pattern for every rulebook for every game. This is just kind of a generally accepted standard default way of doing things for most games. What matters most of all is to create a structure that works for your game. Especially in the last couple of years, there's been loads of really interesting experimentation with rulebook design and rulebook love, where you play through almost like a legacy deck, but every now and then is a tutorial card which tells you how the next section of the game will work. And it's like, yeah, tutorial by way of legacy game mechanics. Genius stuff. Games that have integrated apps which teach the game as you play. We've seen a few of those recently. So there's all sorts of stuff going on. All this is like a general, here's the best way to get started. And then once you've got that, by all means, go and experiment. So what do we have in these different sections? Let's look at the introduction first. We have the overview. To my mind, the first thing a player should see when they open your rulebook, once they've got past the contents page, the credits, any legal mumbo jumbo needs to go in there, you need to give them the elevator pitch for your game. Okay, you're introducing the theme, and I would always put the theme first, because I think the theme first is a good way to sell them on the mechanics. Once they've got the theme in mind, the mechanics will make more sense to them. Of course, if your game has no theme, if it's an abstract game, then skip that. But get that theme in there first and foremost. And then, in very, very general brief terms, tell them what they'll be doing mechanically. So, for example, this is a game all about exploring space and trying to be the first person to build an intergalactic communications network. In the game, players will do this by drafting hands of cards and tackling interstellar dangers from the challenge deck or something. So using very broad terms, single paragraph for theme, single paragraph for mechanics, you're just telling people what the game is. So if someone's gone to a board game cafe, picks off the shelf, the first thing they get to when they read your rulebook is just a little kind of introduction. They can use that to the table and say, do we want to play this? Then, still in the introduction, we lay out the components. Now, this is important. If you've got a game that has components, if you're doing a board game and there are lots of different pieces, meeples and cubes and bags and goodness knows what, list all of them and establish their names. This is a point where you can lay in that rules term, and there's very little mental load here because you're going to have literally a picture of a component and the name of the component. That name is a rules term that you're introducing, and immediately it's describing what it is because it is that component. So get it into your components list. Don't just use words, use captioned pictures, because then when you use the term challenge card a chapter later, players already know what that is. And if they don't, they can turn back and they know, oh, it's that. Cool. And that's there. Incidentally, if you're doing things like cards, it's always helpful in a components list to show both the front and the back so they can see what both sides look like. Make sure you're being nice and thorough and, showing off all the different pieces. I personally love putting a big double page spread of all the components in any rule books I do for board games, because it just lets players know what everything is. There's nothing that winds me up quicker than trying to unpunch a board game and figure out what all the pieces are from a bullet pointed list when you're going to like just quantities. Well, it says there are 17 resource tokens, so I suppose these ones must be the resource tokens. Put pictures in your rule books, please. It doesn't have to be fancy. If you're not good at graphic design, in your draft rule books, lay everything out. Take a photo with your camera. Write on bits of paper next to it and put them there. Resource tokens. Take a picture, put it in your rule book. Easy. Let a graphic designer worry about the details later. Also, at this stage, you can list any components that players need to provide. This is quite common in role-playing games. Each player will need 3 6-sided dice, a pen and paper, or whatever it might be. But again, you're laying out the names for those things and letting players know what things they're going to be using in the game. We carry on through the introduction now. We've told the players kind of what the game's about. We've shown them what they'll be using. Now tell them what they're working towards. A lot of the time, this will be how the game ends or how they win. If it's a cooperative game, the players are working together to do blank. Give them some momentum so they know what they're pushing toward, which direction they're going in. Role-playing games. What sort of game is this trying to be? What are the players trying to achieve? What does a good session look like? Yeah. Tell the players what might get in their way. The players are trying to explore space and set up a intergalactic communications network, but they are having to deal with alien bureaucracy and asteroid swarms. Look out for those things. They're going to come in. So as a player, there's a chance that certain things are going to get in your way. It could be the other players. You're working against the other players to be the first to do X, Y, or Z. So give the players some context and a direction. So that's the introduction. We then come into the core game mechanics. I guarantee this is the section that no one forgets to put into their rulebook, because this is a section that, for a start, you've been working on the most at this point. If you've been working through our process, by the time you come here, this is basically the developed, grown-up version of your vertical slice that you wrote earlier on. So earlier on, you will have laid out your kind of core gameplay mechanics, and this is where it all starts coming in. So the first part of that is setup, which is the thing you would have added in the mechanical build after you've got the vertical slice going. You'll go, right, now we say, how do we set up and get to this point? So yeah, we know this already, right? How does the game get laid out? Get some nice big illustrations, show players, number them, annotate them. Each player draws a hand of cards from the challenge deck, and have a picture of the challenge deck with a number 4 next to it or something, and just put a little 4 in brackets after that. So players know what it is they need to draw cards from. Setup should be as simple as possible and avoid as much as possible going into detail. It's very tempting to start adding in little bits of detail and explanation, but think of it in the way, when you teach a game, I often find that it's best not to explain in great detail what every component is as I'm laying it out or showing the players. This is the exploration deck. Every turn we're going to do this and whatever else. You're going to give them all this information and front load it. Don't do it. Don't worry about explaining what everything does in setup or even in components. It's tempting to do it there as well. Just tell them what it is, where it goes, and we'll come to the actual detail later. Then we get into how to play. This will be the longest section, I guarantee it, and it will have the most subsections, the most levels in its hierarchy. You're teaching the players how the game works, right? So you're going into all your rules in detail. All your rules should be codified. This is really where the rule book is going to be. You'll see the dichotomy most between teacher and reference. This is where you have to figure out really how you're going to do that, because yes, you're going to, with the setup section, once people have played a couple of games, they'll know how to set up, right? So that's very much on the teacher side of things. Components list, once they've played it a couple of times, they don't need to know. So that's very much the teacher side of things. Reference, though, people will come back to this because they'll need to check rules once they're playing. So this is the section that you'll probably put the most work into. Importantly, though, don't get bogged down. Focus on the core experience. Focus on the things that people would play in their first game or first couple of games. If there are additional elements that you've added to increase replayability or make the game more interesting for experienced players, keep those out. We'll talk about those in additional rules. Okay. Importantly, at this stage as well, in the core game mechanics, talk about how a game ends. Again, you will have introduced this in your mechanical build rulebook. And actually, next week, we're going to, at the start of the section next week, there's going to be a short thing on how to actually take your mechanical build rulebook and start a full build rulebook, because it shouldn't be a smooth transition. You should start a whole new thing. There should be a whole new document for this. But don't forget, because you've put it into the mechanical build, how the game ends. Be explicit about what triggers the end of a game. You can remind players here what the objective is. You would have told them earlier, but now tell them again. Remember, when this thing happens, the game ends, and the player who has done this is the winner, or whatever it might be. If you have a winner or winners, it says explain how they're determined. So the player who has established the most communications hubs, the player with the most victory points, whichever player gets this thing first. Some games might have a defined endpoint. So if you're doing a game that is, say, like a story game or a role-playing game, it might mean that your game is designed to run over sessions. So instead, think about, at this stage, not how a game ends, but what happens at the end of a session. So when does a session come to an end? What is the thing that triggers the end of a session, and what things do you have to do at that point? Some role-playing games will do XP and upgrades and things at the end of a session. So that's your core game mechanics. Now we're into the additional rules. So basically, this is anything that isn't integral to the core experience of the game. Ask yourself, if you were teaching people the game for the first time, would you include this thing? If the answer is no, it's probably a candidate for additional rules. Now, there are different ways of doing this. When I did Titanicus for Games Workshop, I actually had kind of 2 levels of additional rules. I had the basic rules, and then the advanced rules, and then optional rules. So the basic rules were the don't overburden yourself. Here's a simplified version for your first game. The advanced rules turned it into the full game, and it was very explicit in the rulebook. The advanced rules and the core rules together, that is the core gameplay experience as intended. The basic rules are there to help you learn the game. The optional rules were things which, to my mind, overcomplicate the core experience, but I knew some players would want to have them in there. So there were rules in there for like destroying buildings. So your giant robots could flatten buildings, but it kind of requires you to have a battlefield with removable rubble piles, whatever else. So that's an optional rule. Some people will want to do that, and they'll be upset if it's not in there, but that's kept out. What's important, as it says there, is you must have that well-defined core experience. I've seen several games. We've had some discussion in the last couple of weeks on the Discord server about this. Games where there are lots of different options for how to play, and it kind of leaves it to the player. It says, oh, you can do it however you like. You can play it this way or this way or this way. Here's a whole toolbox of different rules. If you don't define a core experience, you are offloading your work as a designer to the player, because someone has to read that with potentially no context. They've maybe just picked up your game to give it a go. They have to figure out what is the best way to play it for their first time. So always make sure you've got that core experience. The way to think of it is all of your optional rules, whatever else, are expansions that are included in the game. I've recently been playing Taverns of Tiefenthal, which is a fantastic board game by Wolfgang Warsch, who's a brilliant German designer. And that has literally, I think, 4 expansions in the box. The modules, it refers to them as. It says, for your first game, play this. For your next game, introduce this. And then you can introduce these things whenever you want to afterwards. So the core experience is defined. The other things are basically expansions, and they are treated as separate things. And I would say develop them separately. So literally have your core game that you develop, and then go back to through the development process for each of your additional variants or optional rules or modules. Also, in this section, you might have resources. Now, this varies game to game, but things like scenario lists, faction lists, character sheets, selections of random tables, all sorts of stuff that you can imagine that players might need to refer to at various points that don't appear anywhere else in the rulebook. It's like they need to go here, and they probably won't need it in their first game because, as it says there, you should include some level of this in the core game. Say you're making a war game, and it's a war game where there's always a scenario. You might have a single scenario in the core rules, which is this is the scenario to use for your first game. But then later on, it now says at the start of a game, pick a scenario, and here's a list of 12. Okay, so you're separating this stuff out and putting it all back here towards the back where players can get to it once they've been through their first couple of games. Then we get to the back matter. Back matter is a publishing term, meaning the stuff that goes at the back of a book, attributions and author's notes, whatever else. And what we include here is, this is what I was saying earlier, this is stuff that will answer questions during play. So any reference aids, by which I mean things which are mentioned elsewhere in the book, but you're going to put them here so the player can find them really easily by going to the back. This could be literally on your back page, or you can have a back few pages. The rulebook for Steel Colosseum at the back has an index, a glossary with page references and explanations of rules terms. It has some frequently asked questions, come onto that in a second, and it's got an appendix of different setups for how you can set up the arena. So any of that sort of stuff, which probably generally appears elsewhere, you put it here so someone can refer to it quickly and easily. Okay. Importantly, you want to leave that bit until quite late in the process, because if you change a rule, you have to remember to change it here as well. One of the most common erratas on any board game errata list is the rule on page 7 is different from how it is in the reference. Which one's correct? And the answer is it's always the rule on page 7 because the reference didn't get updated. So it's best to leave your quick reference guide till the very end of the process. And yeah, finally, FAQs and commentary. So if you've got a rule people often forget or tend to use wrong, or one which once they've played the game a couple of times, it makes lots of sense, but for the first game or so, they might not quite get it, you can write a little section about it in here. You can also add commentary to cards or give more examples. If you've got a game that has lots of cards in it, and the way a card is worded means that there might be a couple of edge cases that come up which will be a bit weird and require some extra explanation. Instead of bogging down your card with paragraphs of text in tiny font, you can put a commentary here so that you can explain it in more detail with some diagrams maybe. Do ask yourself, though, at this point, if something's being put in here, should you have fixed it and made it better? That's not necessarily always the case, but sometimes it is the case that you're putting things in here because actually you should have done some more testing and you're covering your back with this. Of course, I've never been guilty of that at all. I've never done that whatsoever. Completely innocent. Honest. Key points, though. Your rulebook is mirroring what you would do if you were sat there at the table teaching the game. That 4-part sequence will help you with your flow of information or make sure things go in the right order. And yeah, not all games will use all the things here, but I would recommend that everything that was listed there is a good default, and the decision to not include it should be an active decision, by which I mean you are actively deciding, no, that's wrong for my game, not just you forgot to put it in. So that can almost work as a checklist, right? Any questions on that? I think I've seen a few loading up in the chat, so throw your questions in. Would you refer to where the edge cases are listed while explaining the main rule? Yes, so players are aware beforehand that they're edge cases. I would say if you're in the rule, I would often, if you've got like a commentary section at the back for that sort of thing, I would say at the start of the, towards the start of the document, I'm quite a fan of putting in little designers' notes in box outs in rule books. Sometimes it will be a character saying it, sometimes it's literally designers' notes, so it's me saying it. But it will say, at the back of the rule book is a section on clarifications for edge cases for certain things. You can, if a card doesn't seem to be clear, you can look there and see if it's found out. So you can direct players towards it. I would say if there's an edge case on a card or a component, then definitely put it into the back. If it's in like the core rules text, though, I would have that in the rule, like in the actual core mechanics. It's good to have examples within your rules text. So say you've got a rule which has lots of different ways it can go. Maybe have a little page of 3 or 4 examples just showing, oh, in this example, this thing happens. In this example, this thing happens. Box it out, make it, format it differently. People know that it's something they can skip over if they want to. I often skip over examples in rulebooks unless I really need to go and read it, and I only look at them when a question comes up. But yeah, I would say it's good to let people know that section is there. And if you wanted to kind of add references to it, this rule has additional permutations as explained on this page. But if you have to put that on every card where it's a potential thing, then that could take up space in the card. Maybe have a little icon potentially saying there's more information about this card here. But what you don't want to do is make players jump to that section every time they read that rule. What you want them to be able to do is go to it if they have an issue. For example, if you describe how to move, but in some cases the move may be affected by other components, in which case, should you go into the move section or later on? So one of the best ways I've seen of doing this is having a little sidebar next to your rules. So you've got like maybe a 3-column layout using 2 columns on your A4 page for the rules, and the 3rd column is reserved for a little sidebars and notes. Having a little box out which says, see also these sections. And what it will say is under the movement section, it will say, see terrain, see psychology, whatever else it is that might come into the movement rules. But yeah, because you'll have rules that don't neatly fit into one thing or another thing. So the rules for moving through terrain, is that in the movement rules or in the terrain rules? Well, make a note wherever you put it. Make a note in the other one that it's there. Okay, kind of comes to that whole page references thing I was talking about earlier. And then yeah, conveniently at 9 o'clock, that is the end of it. So we're on to the exercise for this week. It's a pretty easy one actually. I didn't want to do anything too crazy because it's something that really won't come in handy until you come to the point of writing a rule book, but it's a good exercise to get your brain in gear. This is about identifying the hierarchy of a rule book. So it's like a reviewing exercise. It's something you can do, again, to your own things or to someone else's. But all I'd say for this one, find a published game. Don't go for Twilight Imperium or Warhammer 40,000 or anything with massive rule books. Keep it simple. Pick a rule book and go through and write down each of its headings. So, I mean, just a simple abstract game even. Write down the headings, one per line, and write down the level that the heading is. See if you can recognize from the formatting whether it's a 1, 2, 3. You can use indentation like the thing we had earlier. And look at how the information flows through that document. Analyze that structure. Look at the sections and consider the topics. So is that heading 1 there? That's that topic. Does that then mean that everything that's a header 2 beneath it is relating to the same topic? Ask yourself, does it make sense? And would you change anything? And it's interesting to start becoming critical of rulebooks in this way because it helps you become a better rules writer. It'll help you become a better designer in the long run. And it will ruin your ability to enjoy reading a rule book to learn a game. But it's still worth doing. And then, yeah, as it says, if you find out anything interesting, let me know which games you look at on the Discord channel. Also, I'd love to know which games you do look at, because it's always nice to know which ones have got good or bad rule books. And yeah, it's become a hobby of mine, finding good and bad rule books. There's a game, Root. If anyone's played Root, Root is a fantastic little game, very complicated, but has a very good rule book. It's one of my favorite examples of a good rule book over the last few years. So yeah, there we go. That is this week done. That's an hour of dense information about rule books. Next week, we're going to talk about what happens after you've done all of this work, once you've got your game more or less finished. So we'll also talk a little bit about the actual process of writing your full draft and then kind of what you do with it once you've written it. So that'll be a fun one. And then that'll be it. That'll be the last one. Then it'll all be over. And you'll all be fully accomplished game designers. That's how it works, I'm sure. As ever, if you've got the slides already, if you have any questions, come ask me directly, email me, ask me on Discord. If you enjoyed it, let people know. Need a Cat Design course. It's always nice to have more people coming along and doing things. Once this is all over, we'll be releasing like a packaged set of all the recordings for people. So yeah, it's been a fun time. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording now.